Hey, and welcome to this playthrough of GBA Doom, the fan source port that I covered a few weeks back in one of my videos. People were keen to see more of this, so I figured I'd do a playthrough of Knee Deep in the Dead here, and I'd go through some of the quirks that I've spotted, some of the things that make this version interesting, and just why I think this is better or worse than the official Game Boy Advance port of Ultimate Doom. As you can see from this room here, it's using the original level set, so it's not using the Jaguar levels that the official Game Boy Advance Doom port does. And what that means is that the switch here to head outside to the Toxic Pit is actually there. And that's pretty cool. When we open the door here, not shoot it, you can see that it's using the standard texture set. For those who are going to ask, I am playing this through the Game Boy Advance GameCube player. I'm using Swiss and the Game Boy interface to play this, so I'm using the high fidelity setting, so this is as good as this game is going to look. You have to keep in mind when we're looking at this that this is designed for a Game Boy Advance screen, which of course is not super large, so objects in the distance are always going to look super fuzzy. What I want to do now, I just want to let you have a quick listen to the music from this one, and we'll continue talking about the level in a moment. The main thing to take note of in this version is that the performance can be quite variable. From what I've read, the frame rate is uncapped, so while it can go up to 35 frames a second, which is pretty splendid, in some of the busier areas the frame rate can sort of take a bit of a hit. And you'll notice that as we make our way through some of the levels here. But as a proof of concept, I find this whole thing very fascinating. To me, it's super interesting to see what could have been achieved on the Game Boy Advance, because obviously this is running a version of PR Boom. Got all the kills, very nice there. So we'll head into Nuclear Plant here. As you can see in the far distance there, the enemies haven't noticed me, so one thing that I have noticed in this version is that the enemy behaviour and how they're kind of alerted to you seems to be somewhat different, because as you saw at the start of the level there, enemies who were right in front of me didn't wake up, and as you're seeing walking around this room, not all the enemies have been alerted to my presence, but there'll be other times in this playthrough where they will be when I fire my weapon, which is an interesting quirk. One of the things as well that really kind of impresses me is that the control scheme is pretty easy to use. Once you kind of get used to the D-pad controls, it does get a bit easier to use, because obviously when you're playing Doom you'd prefer to have full range of controls, but with a lot of these console ports, and with this one in particular, the D-pad is your friend. You can use the analog stick on the GameCube, and I will be using that at various points just to sort of share things up. But in terms of control, it's actually pretty easy to kind of move around in this version, which is nice. You can just see the dots in the distance where the shotgun guys are. So you can see there that these guys around the corner here didn't wake up to shoot me or approach me until I kind of appeared in front of them. And again, that kind of goes to show that the way that the sounds work in this version of the game is slightly different, because enemies don't actually sort of react to gun sounds. One can only assume that's been done for performance issues, to sort of stop enemies from wandering around in the far distance of the levels, because sometimes that can happen. I'm going to let you have a listen to the music for a little bit here of this level, just so you can kind of get a feel for the atmosphere. In terms of visuals, I think that what this version of Doom really does well is it manages to bring that sort of variety of textures from the Doom 1 experience. Because in Doom 1 there's a lot of green textures, there's a lot of brown textures, and there's a lot of grey textures, and they all kind of blend together in this first episode to really kind of create that feeling that you're wandering around an abandoned base. And in a recent video, I actually kind of covered this maze in particular, and how this maze is tackled across the different console ports was really interesting to kind of look at, because they all kind of try to do very slightly different things, either by changing the lighting or changing the textures on the walls. The original Game Boy Advance version of this game is quite faithful to what this maze actually was in the PC version, because it has the flickering lights, it has the right layout, and overall I think it does a decent job of capturing this space, even if it does make use of reduced texture sets. The main thing with this maze is that you've got this flickering light going on, and you also have to remember that the original Game Boy Advance version of Doom was somewhat handicapped by the hardware, because remember, the original Game Boy Advance version of Doom released onto a console that didn't have a backlight. Okay, so the performance took a bit of a dive on these stairs here. It's interesting because across a lot of the console ports of this level, a lot of the console ports struggle with those same stairs, and I suspect it's because there's just a lot of sector work going on into rendering that area, and obviously with the enemies on it as well and the fast movements, things can get very taxing on the consoles. Final room here, it is with the elevator. Some of the console versions don't make use of the elevator here, and that is Nuclear Plant. Nuclear Plant, again, fun level, and in this version in particular, very interesting to wander through. So we're up to the third level here. This is Toxin Refinery. This is going to be a very interesting room to kind of walk into in terms of performance, because there's a lot going on here. There's the space down below in front of us, there's lots of enemies, there's a lot of space in this one for the Game Boy Advance to handle. As I was mentioning though, the original Game Boy Advance didn't actually have a backlight on it. It was only when the Game Boy Advance SP arrived that became a thing. So a lot of these Game Boy Advance games had options to change the lighting, which is why in the original Doom 1 you can actually turn on and off the static lighting to try and make the visuals better. People forget that kind of thing, which is why I like Doom 2 having everything blown up super bright on the Game Boy Advance was probably more bearable until the Game Boy Advance SP showed up and kind of exposed that completely. In this version though, the lighting is pretty much as it was in the original, which is very much appreciated. I do like the varied look of these rooms. See if we can kill you. The music in this version is pretty interesting to talk about. It's kind of a weird sort of blend of several of the console styles. It kind of has the sort of wailing and the sort of weirdness of the 32X version in my opinion, but it also kind of has the original Game Boy Advance sort of sound in there in terms of the music, and it's definitely a different interpretation of the music. And on Game Boy Advance hardware in particular, it suits very well, even if I think it does have like a bit of a wobblingness to it, that it does make it seem a bit weird at points. Heading into this room here, this is one of the rooms that I always sort of have a good look at whenever I play these console ports, because it's this room out here where things can really get testing for some of these console ports. This is one of those rooms where there's a lot going on. It's a big space, there's lots of areas around for the player to sort of fall into, so there's lots for the game to render down below, on this level, up above. And honestly, it's handling this pretty well, I'd have to say. I can definitely tell you there are much worse ways to experience this room, and on much less versions of this room. A lot of the console ports have this as a flat room, so you kind of lose the bits on the outside where the player can get trapped. Another thing I kind of prefer about this version over the Game Boy Advance retail version of this is that the blood is actually the correct colour, because in the Game Boy Advance version it is kind of infamously green, and for me it just kind of looks a bit silly. I'm not going to lie about that. I don't mind different coloured blood in Doom, but for me it kind of looks a bit silly when like everyone is green, including the dead soldiers on the floor who clearly are humans. It's just one of the quirks of the Game Boy Advance version of Doom 1. I'm going to destroy that barrel because there's a load of shotgunners in here and any of them can shoot that barrel if they feel like it. Take out all these enemies here. That texture in the middle there, the weird kind of computer texture, it looks really weird at this low pixel count. It kind of sort of looks a lot choppier, and you can kind of see it again here when you run up to it. It looks really weird. It's definitely one of the worse looking sort of textures that makes it across to this version. And again, that's mostly just down to the Game Boy Advance's resolution, because obviously everything's being sort of scaled down, and sometimes the textures don't look super great when they're being scaled down that much. Take care of all the enemies outside there. Gonna grab the supercharge here. I'll head back to the secret exit here. I was debating whether to even go to the secret level here, but since I'm showing off the whole of Knee Deep in the Dead, it kind of feels like you do need to go there, even if it... Oh, gosh. So, this is probably the ugliest room we've seen so far in this version, and not because the room looks terrible to begin with. It's actually a very interesting looking room, but it's just like that texture is very notably ghastly looking, let's be fair. Definitely be grabbing the box of rockets from up here. Up to now, there really hasn't been anything too surprising in terms of performance. I would say that there has been the occasional dip here and there, but that obviously comes with the territory when you have an uncapped frame rate. I'm going to be interested to see how this opening room performs here. Oh, okay. Okay, so this is probably the first time in this whole thing where you can see the game is kind of struggling a tiny bit with what's going on here. It's not unplayable, but it's definitely a sort of step down from what we've been seeing so far. I can only hazard a guess because there's a bunch of steps around this room. There's a bunch of enemies in the middle here. It is a big open space as well. Once we kind of head down into these areas around the side though, things kind of return to more normal. I say more normal because obviously with the frame rate kind of being variable, it can be all over the place. There's no real sort of set point where the game likes to put things in terms of performance. So let's see how disgusting this room is. So it's not too bad. I don't think it's the high enemy count that's causing issues, although I definitely think in that opening room it contributed to the dip in performance that we saw. We'll now head across the way and do the other wing. That's the blue door. So again, the enemies didn't all wake up there for me. Normally in this room they don't wake up anyway, I don't think, but especially the spectres, I know that they're set to ambush because they like to attack you when you come through the steps there. Let's head down here. So it's not doing too bad with this room here. This is a very big room for Ultimate Doom, I'd argue, and there's a bunch of pillars there in the centre and there's different levels going on. Let's head towards the yellow door here. I'm going to just let you kind of enjoy the ambience of the next bit here, just so you can kind of enjoy what the music is like on this level without my voice going over it. This part here should be interesting because there's a whole bunch of pinkies who are going to come running down the steps here. It's worth keeping in mind as well, the Game Boy Advance was not designed for 3D gaming, and obviously Doom is not a true 3D game, but in terms of the hardware, it does push the Game Boy Advance to its limits in terms of what it can achieve. The Game Boy Advance didn't have that many 3D games on it, and a lot of the 3D games that are on the Game Boy Advance had to make a lot of compromises to get there. So when you're seeing all this and going, well, that's not a great frame rate, you have to keep in context the hardware that we are seeing this run on. The Game Boy Advance was not a super powerful hardware, and most of the games on it were designed for 2D gaming and side-scrollers and top-down games. They weren't really designed for this level of gaming. I'm going to see if I can do the skip here. It's actually a bit harder to strafe run in this version, and no, we can't. There's always a chance that you might die down here. If you get sort of stuck in the toxic fighting the imps there, they can sap your health pretty aggressively. Let's see what's through here. It is nice to see all the enemies are here and present and correct. They haven't reduced the enemy count in this version of this game at least, and you know, you're getting the full Doom experience, just maybe a bit choppier than you'd expect. I always forget that this room is supposed to be void of enemies, because in the PlayStation version, if you come in here, there's actually a pain elemental, and obviously that is not in this version here. Okay, we've missed that. Not really worth hanging around, so let's head to the next level here. Other than a few brief moments there, I'd argue the performance was very, very playable. Even in the moments where the game wasn't at its best performance-wise, I think that it was still playable to the extent where you'd be willing to play it on a Game Boy Advance. It is worth noting that in the Game Boy Advance version, it is not super stable itself. It does have some moments where the performance does go for a bit of a wander. This is always one of the rooms that kind of suffers from the Jaguar level set, just because of how brown it ends up looking. It does kind of end up looking like one of the uglier areas in Ultimate Doom on the Jaguar level set. And of course, in the Jaguar level set, the middle part here is actually not present. They actually remove that completely. So all of this isn't accessible on the Game Boy Advance version, but here it is in this version. Take out all of the enemies up top there. We'll head up here. The trap here will open up with all of the enemies inside. So what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to let you have a quick listen to the music of this one. You can decide if you like it or not. Of course, this version does not have the naughty symbol in that room. I know some people get weirdly upset about that and the fact that it doesn't have an appearance in all of the versions of this level, which I find a bit weird. I think this is a good place to kind of show off just how the enemy alert system works, because earlier on I mentioned that enemies don't seem to react to you, but the thing is, if you shoot a weapon and there's enemies around you in your immediate vicinity, they do all sort of seem to wake up. As you can see there, the imps were very eager to crowd around me. It is peculiar how that behaviour works in this version. This is arguably one of the most pointless parts of Ultimate Doom. This maze really offers nothing. There's nothing in this maze to warrant coming through here except killing all the enemies. Most players, I can imagine, have never even wandered through here, just because it's kind of pointless. There's really nothing to see here. Oh, there's a pinky behind me. I can feel them blocking me from backing up there. I could have got very nasty there if I wasn't careful. Overall though, the performance on this level seems to be a lot more stable than what we saw in the secret level. I think it helps that this level's got a lot more sort of enclosed spaces and narrow corridors. Things aren't quite as expansive, which makes it a bit easier for this level to sort of make things happen without chugging along. Welcome to the blue room. Overall though, there's not much you can really say about this one. It's a solid experience. Again, I think that it definitely compares to what you get in the retail version, and overall I think that this level is not that particularly demanding, at least compared to some of the other levels that we've been seeing, so the fact that the performance is like this does not surprise me at all. This level here is going to be kind of interesting. So immediately, if you can't hear it, the music is very much unique to this one. I'm going to immediately let you experience this just so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Game Boy Advance games have this very unique sound font to them, and you can definitely kind of hear that presence in this interpretation of this music. This is probably the most Game Boy Advance sounding music we've heard so far, and when I say Game Boy Advance sounding music, if you've ever played Game Boy Advance games, or multiple ones of them, you'll know exactly what I mean when I say it sounds like a Game Boy Advance game. The wobbling gets me. As we open the yellow door here, we'll head inside. There's a bunch of enemies inside here, so we'll see how that affects things. But once again, this is 1-to-1 with the PC version. When I was doing my no-hit run, this was one of the areas that gave me an absolute nightmare to work out how to get through. Would not imagine ever wanting to try that on this version, although that would be a fun challenge. The main thing here is that I don't accidentally trip this trap too early. It's also worth noting that in the original Game Boy Advance version of Doom 1, the music's kind of incorrectly lined up, so you don't even get the right music on the right levels, which is always something that really bugged me. It really put me off that version for a long time because it was like you were getting the wrong atmospheric music on each level. I like how that switch, by the way, just disappears as we kind of back away from it. It does kind of go to show you how, when textures are in the distance, the game does its absolute best to... Oh wow, I very nearly made a mistake there with that barrel. It just goes to show you how, like, the textures kind of have to morph and warp to work in this version. It kind of reminds me of how Doom 2 is on the Game Boy Advance. There's some very aggressive scaling of the textures in that version, and it can lead to a very ugly experience, in particular in some of the downtown levels where everything just becomes like a brown smudge. Head inside here. Is it me or is this a bit lighter than it is in the PC version? Maybe I'm just misremembering that room. Oh, hello you. Grab this secret here. I definitely think this is lighter than it is in the PC version. Maybe it's just the way that this is rendering the sector lighting. But there's been a few times when we've gone through these levels where I'm kind of looking in it and it's not as dark as it is normally. Maybe that's just the way that this version is handling the sector lighting. We're not going to be hitting that switch. Gonna see how this room is here, because this room is notoriously dark. Oh, you can see the pulsing light is still here. Okay. So at least this room hasn't sort of gone through any kind of changes. We're going to ruin all that lighting now by turning everything up to max brightness. This is probably one of the more horror-based moments in Ultimate Doom, and I can imagine a lot of people who got to this point probably found this part very terrifying back in the day, because unless you can find those goggles to make things super bright, this can be quite a nerve-wracking experience. And that's compounded by the fact that when you try to rush the exits at the end of this level, if you just rush through and try not to kill all these enemies, not only do you have these spectres who will ambush you from behind in the darkness, but you will also have the pinkies in the exit room that basically serve as shields to slow you down. So you kind of have to deal with these and the enemies behind you. So being able to experience this on handheld was probably very interesting back in the day. Excuse me. Thank you very much, I wanted that to be done. So we're done with Phobos Lab there. Probably one of the more atmospheric levels in this Knee Deep in the Dead level set, and one of the ones that, while it doesn't see that many changes in the Game Boy Advance version, a number of small alterations kind of change the way it feels. Oh, that music, I'm sorry. So, once again, the music is very much open to interpretation of what you feel about it. For me, that opening there was a bit distracting, I'm not going to lie. We'll take down the enemies here. So the major changes between this and the Game Boy Advance version of this level is that this whole section through here is basically non-existent. This whole area in there is gone, and in the Jaguar level sets there's a trap here when you pick up the key card. It basically opens up some spectres behind you there, but in this version you can see we actually get to go inside, and there's the 30-second trap that I'm going to have to activate here. So none of this is actually in the original version of this level on Game Boy Advance. Just wanted to see if I could get any of the enemies with the barrels there. Oof. Once we activate this trap here, I'm expecting things to get very spicy in terms of performance. This isn't a very particularly demanding room, even though it's quite large, because it's pretty much a flat room with a bunch of big walls in it, which actually makes things a little bit easier for the Game Boy Advance. You can see it's actually very playable, surprisingly. Although trying to identify the enemies as they're kind of approaching us is a bit difficult when they all kind of blend into the background so easily. Also, make sure you always kill this shotgun here. In every version of this game, that guy does not wake up. You actually have to go in front of him for him to wake up. It's kind of amusing, and many 100% runs have fallen to him not waking up. We'll head into the red door here. One aspect I haven't really talked about yet, but I do think is kind of worthy of praise. They really do nail the Doom sounds from the weapons, the enemies, the item pickups. It's all pretty much on point in terms of that. If you don't like the music in this one, at least you can appreciate the fact that it sounds like Doom when you're playing it. Speaking of, I'm going to let you have a little experience of this one, just so you can kind of hear this music without me talking over it. Normally when I'm playing through Ultimate Doom, I will never come into this maze, but because I want to kind of show off all of Knee Deep in the Dead, and I want to make sure that you get a good idea of the different kind of environments in this version of Doom and how they look, I am going to kind of wander through and we're going to see what this area has to offer. In fact, this is probably one of the more ideal locations for a handheld version of Doom, just because there's a lot of narrow corridors here, there's a lot of spaces where the game doesn't really have to render that much outside of what's happening immediately in front of us, and the enemies are never overwhelmingly large in number, although I'm pretty sure if I got all the enemies to follow me through the maze, we could maybe change that. At this point, you should have a good idea that a lot of these normal knee deep in the dead levels, they do perform pretty well on this version, and it does kind of raise the idea that maybe they could have squeezed these levels into the Game Boy Advance in the first place. Recently I've been playing the Super Nintendo version of Ultimate Doom a fair bit, and one thing that always strikes me about that version is just how ambitious it is. And the Game Boy Advance version basically goes in the opposite direction completely. It doesn't really try to be super ambitious outside of trying to get the Jaguar levels to work, whereas the Super Nintendo version actually goes as close to the PC levels as it can, and it's the only console version that really makes that effort until the Xbox version in the mid-2000s. And it does make me wonder, if they'd had more time, if they'd had a bit more chance to optimize the experience, could they have maybe replicated the SNES experience on the Game Boy Advance? Because for me, this is a very good proof of concept that yes, there was actually a lot of room for that to happen. The reason I'm bringing all that up is because officially the Super Nintendo version is actually getting an update, well, a re-release, that will see it sort of bring in the 4th episode and attempt to squeeze as much performance out of the Super Nintendo as possible. And I kind of view this as the equivalent for the Game Boy Advance version. Even though this isn't an official product like that Super Nintendo remake is going to be, it does kind of show you that even on consoles where you wouldn't think there was much headroom to make improvements or to even include these levels, there is a lot of scope for that to happen. And as people go back and kind of have the chance to optimize, it does kind of give you that what if they'd had a bit more time, what if there wasn't time constraints on getting this out so quickly to sort of capitalize on the Game Boy Advance being a new hardware. And that's one thing I really love about the Doom community compared to other communities in gaming. There's a lot of desire to see Doom sort of push the boundaries, and I think one of the more underdeveloped part of that is going back and seeing how far you can push it on consoles where maybe the original experience wasn't that great. Because I'm pretty certain, like for example with the 3DO, if people went back and had the time, you could definitely make a much better version of Doom on that console. But that's just something that I have a keen interest in. I love seeing games like Doom running on consoles at their best, and seeing this on the Game Boy Advance, seeing all these levels in their uncut and full forms is really impressive to me, even to this day. It's just something that really interests me, and it's one of the reasons why when I'm making these videos I'm always fascinated to sort of push these consoles as far as I can, just to sort of see what you can get out of them and what kind of experience gamers could have had in an alternate universe. Oh, hello. Didn't see you behind me. This trap room is always a nightmare to me. I always get sort of stuck in here. When I used to sort of try speedrunning, and yes, I did try speedrunning for a while, I would always get stuck in this room. I'd usually die in this room because trying to rush through this room was always a terrible, terrible idea. These days I always just do it in layers, this room. The rocket launcher doing all the heavy lifting for me here. Hit the switch here. There's going to be a bunch of spectres who come out of here. So this is a very tall room. You can see there when that door opened fully there, the performance kind of took a bit of a hit. It does sound like a phone ringing, the music on this level. In particular, on this level, it does actually sound like a phone's ringing in the distance. And that's central processing done. We're coming up to the penultimate level in Knee Deep in the Dead here. This is probably going to be one of the more interesting levels to look at because there's a lot going on this level. Okay, the music on this one isn't quite as sort of fun, but then we'll see what happens when it kicks up in a second. The start of this level is pretty intense. Fun fact, this was the level that really gave me trouble when I was doing my no-hit run. This is the one that when I was doing it on stream, it took forever to figure out even how to get out of that opening area. We're going to take out the enemies up here. It'll make things a bit easier later on when I have to rush through there. The thing about this level is that there's a lot of varied rooms. There's a lot of high rooms, low rooms, a lot of rooms overlooking rooms. There's enemies who, like there for example, have been activated a lot earlier in the level than you'd expect. Can I kill the third one? We'll head over here. Take out the imp. I always forget about these guys. The guys in front of the yellow door here, I always seem to forget that they exist. And I am running a bit low on health here, a little bit less than I would like. We'll sort that out soon. Hopefully I don't take too much damage when we go into the next area. For clarity's sake, I really like this port of Doom. I think that this is a really excellent way to experience Doom on the Game Boy Advance. I've never been a huge fan of Doom on the Game Boy Advance. Doom 1 in particular, I've always kind of found it a bit eh. Even back in the day, I remember when I played it on my Game Boy Advance SP, it just didn't hit for me the way that Doom normally would. Like I said, the issues with the music being in the wrong order, and I think as well, like, there was just other aspects of it that rubbed me the wrong way. I really think if this had been the experience, I probably would have enjoyed it a lot more. Getting shot from outside the window there. Normally I'd shoot rockets across there, but I really don't fancy it here. Again here, another complex room. There's a lot of varying heights, there's a lot of enemies, in particular in that window over there. And there's enemies in that window there. Run over here, grab the goodies. Now, normally I would never head up into that room there, but I feel like, why not? Let's have a quick look at see how it feels in this version. While we're heading around this area, I am going to let you kind of listen to the music just for a little bit. So from this point in this level, we have a bunch of enemies who are going to be opened up to us because there's a bunch of monster closets that will have opened up. I want to try grabbing this map thing. I ran too far. It's really not worth it, let's be honest there. There is a blue armor behind this pillar here. Grab the supercharger there. This is one of those monster closets I was talking about. As we head towards the yellow door here, there's going to be a bunch of monsters behind here. Unfortunately, there's not much you can really do about this. You're just going to have to take them on head on. You could walk around to the other side, but the thing is the monsters will just follow you to that door. It's genuinely just worth taking them out at the door there. There's a whole bunch of shotgunners out here, and because this is a large open area, I am going to be curious to see how nightmarish it is to handle. So you can see, the second we went outside the frame rate took a small jump. It didn't drop as much as I was expecting it to, but the main reason this is happening is because there's all this going on. There's all these rooms that's overlooking this area. It's a very congested area, this. And there's also around here all of these shotgunners. So the idea with these shotgunners is they're supposed to sort of get you as you're heading towards the exit, which is particularly nasty. As we head into the blue door here, there's a bunch of enemies waiting for us, and we're pretty much closing in on the end of this one. Again, this level's kind of surprised me. It's not that bad in terms of performance. I would definitely compare this to the Game Boy Advance original. It is a little more unstable here and there, but again, that's owing to the way that this has been constructed. I do feel though that overall this is a more fun experience than the retail Doom game. Head inside here, and this will be the end of a level. So we're going to be heading to the final level here. This is the one with the Barons of Hell. So the main thing on this one is that right at the end of this upcoming level there's going to be a monster room. I have no idea how that's going to perform because there's going to be a whole bunch of monsters and we're not really going to be able to sort of determine how that goes. Ooh. So in this room in the Game Boy Advance version, obviously you don't get this. You get that pedestal with all the enemies on top of it. You definitely don't get all the pinkies right in front of you there. But I would love to know in the comments, like, what people would have thought of this had this been the official retail release. Would people have preferred these original levels, or are people fine with what they got? Do people feel that the Jaguar levels were more suitable across the board? I am somewhat interested in doing a full playthrough of this version, just because I think it would be fun to see how Thy Flesh Consumed levels play across the board, because if there's any levels that will be unplayable in this, it will probably be in that episode. As we make our way in here, you can see that it's the full palette for this room. If you play this on the Jaguar levels, it's a lot more muted in here. Oh, that's interesting. So not all of these spectres are actually coming over to me. It does make me wonder if some of them haven't seen me over on the far side of the room. Yeah, so these two over here hadn't actually seen me, and so they hadn't had a chance to wake up. As you can see here, we've got the Barons of Hell in front of us. the walls are coming down here as they do in the PC version. If you've ever played this Game Boy Advance version, you'll know that the Jaguar level at the end here is a bit different. You don't go into a teleporter and then get attacked. You basically just finish the level when you go through the teleporter. It does change the way this episode ends, but it also means that you get to carry your weapons forward, which I think is a pretty underrated feature. Even this large room, the performance is pretty great. Okay, so that room there was just a complete red blur because it was like not having any of it. And that is Knee Deep in the Dead on the fan source port of Game Boy Advance Doom, and honestly, it's very playable. Other than the odd room here or there where things get a bit complicated for the game, the performance was pretty good across the board, and as you saw, it was not that difficult for me to play this in a normal way. If people would want to see a more thorough playthrough that includes all the other episodes, I am down for that. Let me know what you think of this in the comments. Would you have played this back in the day? Would you prefer to have seen this back in the day? Let me know, and thank you so much for watching.